Head of Biomedical Engineering for Sydney Children's Hospitals Network. I'm also a consultant to the TGA, so that I'm not talking totally from naivety. I haven't given a lecture for a long time, so you'll have to bear with me, and I'd like to thank Alistair for giving me this opportunity. And you're all budding biomedical engineering students, and one of the things I realised along the way when I was a budding biomedical engineering student, or developing devices and things like that, or getting involved in projects and putting 9-volt batteries into little plastic boxes, was that it might have been a good idea to understand what the regulatory framework around medical devices were before I started, rather than at the end of the project, because if it was a successful project, then trying to get the regulatory or meet the regulatory requirements was a lot more difficult. It's much easier to have half an idea what environment you're working in before you start. It's a bit like the law, you know, lack of knowledge of the law is no excuse, you're still guilty. So this talk's broken into 3 parts, or this lecture. First is the history of regulation, and I'd like to talk briefly about that because it's not super interesting, but people sort of think that there's been a big regulatory framework and that's all been set in stone since Jesus was a boy, and that's not quite the case. The regulatory framework has only been around for 100 years, and it's evolving rapidly. So I want to talk about the history of regulation. I want to talk about the current regulatory framework and in Australia, and you should know this because if you break the Therapeutic Goods Act, which all therapeutic goods, of which medical devices are a subclass, the fines are pretty hefty, and up to $250,000 for an individual or $20 million for a corporation. And not that the TGA is particularly aggressive in pursuing people and stuff like that, but it's not like you get a slap on the wrist and a parking ticket if you do get in trouble. It's a bit more serious. It's civil and criminal penalties. And so the last part is what researchers and developers should know and do before they start a device development project. And that's maybe where, I mean, feel free to ask me questions at any time, but that's where it gets interesting, and that depends on what sort of project you're doing and the level of risk associated with that. So the history of regulation, I've just broken it up into time frames here. There's 6 time frames. There's pre-1900, which is prehistory for most people, I'm sure now. There's 1900 to World War II. There's World War II to the 60s. There's the 60s to the 80s. The early 80s is when I got into it. And I can tell you what, there was not very much regulation back in the early 80s. We could basically do what we liked in hospitals with a soldering iron and a hacksaw and a patient. And they started tidying that up in the 90s to 2007. Life got pretty draconian in 2007. And there's been a few modifications of things between 2007 and now. So pre-1900, you were really lucky. There was no regulation of medical devices at all. Who knows what this is? Or no regulation of of therapeutic goods at all. This is laudanum. Laudanum is basically as much heroin as you can dissolve in alcohol in a bottle, okay? So you could buy that quite freely at the pharmacist and you could go home and drink it. You got very drunk, I heard, things like that. The old Greeks, you know, they were into it. This is a Greek sandstone carving that's come out of a Greek temple. Who's into trendy alternative medicine here? Who's heard about cupping, where they put the little cups on you? And yeah, there we go, see? Well, these are the cups that the Greeks used to put on you, right? And they used to heat them up and they used to suck the same way. But phlebotomy, which was bloodletting, was really big in old medicine. So this is the this is the sort of little case with all the scalpels. So what they do is they cut you, and then they put those heat the cups up, put them on, and as they cool down, they'd suck all the blood out of you. And that was supposed to be a very therapeutic thing to have done to you. And in fact, phlebotomy went on to be a accepted medical practice right up until about the 1880s, where you could go in and if you were sick, the doctor would prescribe phlebotomy and you'd go off to the phlebotomist and he could put up to 2,000 little cuts in you to bleed you, and he could take up to 4 or 5 litres of blood out of you at a session and until you basically fainted. So, you know, medical devices have been around for a long, long time. This is Grecian. This picture here is from the Trojan Wars. If anybody really wants to get back into ancient history and study Latin and things like that, that's fine. And here's the picture of the surgeon removing an arrowhead from a famous Grecian warrior's thigh. And that Grecian warrior was called Acephalus. I think I got that right. And he was sort of like, he's now the patron saint of surgery. And to make matters even more interesting, when they were doing archaeological digs around some of the old Grecian temples, they actually found the forceps that this guy was using thousands of years, well, a few thousand years before Christ, to pull out the arrowhead. So surgical instruments have been around for a long, long time. Here's some really old ones. These are for drilling into you and doing all sorts of nasty things, okay? And these were around from Hippocrates' day. These were the ones that Hippocrates used. And Hippocrates was the guy that came up with the oath that all doctors swear, the Hippocratic Oath. And who knows what the Hippocratic Oath is, or the first line of the Hippocratic Oath? That's right. So if you're using these on people, do you think you're going to be doing no harm? All right? Anyway, we'll leave that to you. This is actually, and Hippocrates was a very advanced doctor. This is plates from Hippocrates' time. And this is actually traction fixation for a broken tibia and fibula, where they worked out that they had to push the bones apart and hold them actually extended apart so they'd come back together and heal. And that's still basically the practice we use today. So these guys, even though their technology was primitive, the good ideas still keep going through to the current day. So pre-1900, you know, in Australia and everywhere else, you could buy all this stuff. You could buy anything you wanted over the counter. There was nothing to stop people selling stuff. It was only the use of poisons and things. Like, you weren't supposed to give people cyanide. You weren't supposed to give them lead. You could still go and buy it all. I mean, it's like, you know, having a sort of drug shop here and saying you can buy everything, you're just not allowed to use it. You know, that's not going to happen, is it? So, of course, everybody was into everything because it was free to sale. Just the use was regulated. So pre-1900 it was pretty feral, and you could do really what you like in terms of devices and of drugs. In Australia, we got federated, and we became, the states came together to form the Commonwealth of Australia. And prior to that, all the regulation had been done by the individual states. And one of the most interesting things there was some regulatory powers passed to the Commonwealth, because the states wanted to regulate catgut, and the Commonwealth was still unable to regulate catgut. It hadn't come up. Oops, that's not going to happen. Sorry, I'll just switch that off. So the Commonwealth was unable to regulate catgut because they didn't have sufficient legislative powers. And so between 1900 and World War II, there was issues with regulating catgut. So who knows what catgut is? Who knows what cat's guts are? Who knows what sheep's guts are? What's normally your guts? Oh, come on, someone must have done anatomy. Yeah, your intestines. So the original surgical sutures that they used were made out of pieces of intestine, right? And those surgical sutures, if you read this, to prepare the catgut, the intestines are cleared, freed from fat and steeped in water. After that, the membrane scraped with a blunt knife. The intestines are then once again steeped for some time in lye, which is just basically like caustic soda, smoothed and equalised by drawing out, so they stretched them. Then they were subjected. Subjected to antiseptic action by holding them in sulphur fumes to kill all the bugs and everything on them. And then they were sorted out into necessary sizes and twisted together, and then that's what they sewed people up with. So you can see why people wanted to regulate this stuff, right? Because that was how they made it. To my knowledge, and I don't know if this is true, it was never actually made out of cats' intestines, for those of you who like cats. It was always made from sheep and cows' intestines, all right? And there are many stories as to why it became catgut. So this is catgut here. Some of you might be a bit too young to recognise catgut, and some of you might be a bit too old. I'm a little bit too old. Catgut for you. Sorry, that's a Sesame Street figure who was called Catgut. So and that was the joke because, anyway, sorry. I'll try to keep the jokes out of it, but excuse me if they don't go over very well. So after World War II, they came up with the Therapeutic Substances Act, which was the first substantial Commonwealth legislation in Australia. And so they controlled surgical ligatures for the first time. And so they were basically worried about controlling drugs, because after the Second World War, everybody came back from the Second World War and they were all opiate addicts. And there was lots of problems with the soldiers and things like that. So they realised they had to regulate drugs. But because the states had wanted to regulate catgut, they were able to do this under the 1953 Therapeutic Substances Act. So catgut became the first non-pharmaceutical to be regulated. So that's only 60 years ago. And this... A ligature is a piece of a thread that they use to sew you up, right? Pretty important in medicine. I mean, really, medicine doesn't exist without being able to sew people up. So this is modern surgical catgut. And this is a little packet of it here, and I'm sorry that the resolution wasn't so good on this slide, but this is what it looks like. So if I'm going to sew you up, I can walk into my operating theatre and I can go and get a little packet of this, and I can pull it out and I can stick it in my needle and I can sew you up, right? Or I can cut you apart and cut out whatever I want and sew you up. Believe it or not, surgical catgut is extremely valuable. And the reason it's valuable is it's resorbable, okay? So they still make it, they still use it, you can still buy it in 1,000 different sizes, thicknesses, colours, I was going to say tastes, but maybe not, but and they treat it in different ways to make it stronger and resorb slower or faster into your body. So this is a biological material that has been around ever since they started doing surgery in the Grecian times, and is still used in modern surgery, and is the ligature of preference by many surgeons, even though they've got nylon and synthetics, okay? So, the good stuff persists. The bad stuff doesn't last long in this game. So, in the 1960s, they came up with the Therapeutics Goods Act in 1966, because they realised that lots of goods needed regulated, not just substances. So people were coming up with medical devices. This is the time that it was just pre the transistor era, so all your ECG machines were still valve run and stuff like that, and valves weren't really reliable, and there was lots of issues with people getting electrocuted because it wasn't very safe, and it was you could still basically do what you liked as a doctor or in a hospital, and people were getting hurt and devices weren't doing the right thing, so they realised that the medical device industry was sort of, this wasn't going to go away. They better regulate it like all governments do. If something's going to go away, they leave it alone, but it's going to be around for a while, then they decide they better regulate it, Good example, I don't know, at the moment's carbon tax. We've got climate change, so we better regulate carbon production, In the mid-80s, which is only 30 years ago, was the first time that Australian standards were developed and applied to medical devices. So I talk to people and they go, but Australian standards have been around for hundreds of years. No, 30 years. It allowed them to regulate imports. Before that, you could just import what you like. Now they can stop you importing stuff into Australia. They also came up with what was known as a computerised register of therapeutic goods. So don't forget this. This is in 1980, and I think that was, the first one was on a 286 XT-AT, for those of you who remember your history, because I was around then. And, it maybe had 1,000 medical devices on it, and it was just a flat form, very simple spreadsheet. It was probably before they even had Excel, okay? But it was there. So in 1989, they came out with another piece of Commonwealth legislation, and for those of you who don't understand legislation, state legislation is subservient to Commonwealth legislation. So if the Commonwealth make a law, then the states basically have to follow. The states can't go off and then do their own thing, all right? That's how Australia works. So they defined a therapeutic device as a therapeutic good that achieved its purpose not through chemical action. In other words, it wasn't a drug or something, right? So that was, they were trying to separate pharmaceuticals out from devices. For those of you who, just a little aside here, how much money do we spend in public hospitals in New South Wales on drugs and medical devices and all the stuff that goes with medical devices every year? Guess? Someone have a guess. Come on, auction. How much? No, we spend about $2 billion in New South Wales public hospitals on medical devices and drugs every year, okay? New South Wales public health system is the biggest single public health system in the world, for those of you who don't realise that, that's regulated as one body. So you are sitting in the biggest public health organisation in the world. So if someone has a heart attack here, you go off to Prince Alfred Hospital, they dig your Medicare card out and it's all taken care for free, okay? In the UK, they have the National Health Service, but that's a whole conglomeration of separate little bodies. It's not one big regulatory thing. So with close to 10 million people in New South Wales, we're the biggest single public health body in the world. We spend $2 billion a year on medical devices, which includes everything from band-aids to needles to syringes to X-ray machines to MRIs to radiotherapy machines, and all the drugs we spend in hospitals. We spend about $400 million a year of that $2 billion on drugs. So 4/5 of what we spend in New South Wales public hospitals is on medical devices, not on drugs. Now there is a reason for that, because when you leave the hospital you go and buy your own drugs at the pharmacist. But having said that, within the public health system, 4/5 of the spend is on devices. The expenditure on medical devices is now accelerating at such a rate that it's predicted to overtake pharmaceutical sales. So I guarantee you, when some of you guys get a bit older, the day will come where you'll be able to look at all your pharmaceutical colleagues and go, I told you so, I got into the growth industry. Right? Pharmaceuticals is actually struggling and going backwards at the moment. Anyway, they had the Therapeutic Goods Act where they said that that a therapeutic device, sorry, I didn't get capitalisation quite right, was defined as a therapeutic good that was not a chemical. That was a bit messy, so they had to tidy that up. So they came out in 2002, which was only 10 years ago. I mean, most of you were probably alive then. With the Therapeutic Goods Medical Devices Amendment. Here it is. Got a book there. I didn't bring the Therapeutic Goods Act. It's quite thick and boring, but yeah, you can pass that around if you want. Okay, it's legislation. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so don't... Oh, and by the way, I'm not a lawyer, okay? So... all right. So then in 2005, they realised they didn't have enough bite. This is what I was saying about penalties being quite steep if you break the Therapeutic Goods Act. So they introduced civil penalties, which means they could sue the pants off you but not put you in jail, in parallel to criminal penalties, which means they can just put you in jail, right? In 2005. In October 2007, because the Therapeutic Goods Act was a big change to medical device regulation in Australia, they gave everybody 5 years to conform before they started enforcing it, from 2002 to 2007. So in 2007, it was fully implemented and you had to comply with that. There was a little loophole for some pre-existing Australian manufacturers that they were allowed to grandfather their product onto what's known as the ARTG, or the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. The Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods is what that computerised list of therapeutic devices became. If you don't have your product on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, not only is it illegal to use or sell it in Australia, it's actually illegal to promote it or advertise it, okay? So if you've invented something and you go out there and start saying to your mates, look, I've got this great product, you should all buy it, and you haven't got it on the ARTG, you're actually breaking the Therapeutic Goods Act. And this is the legal definition of a medical device in Australia, and I won't go through it all, but just to show you what it is, all right? Okay? So, but basically it's any device that's used for treatment or diagnosis, okay? But it's long. It includes the advertising material relating to the article, the instructions relating to the article, and anything else the Secretary of the Minister for Health or whoever's in charge of it at the time, because there's two kind of Ministers for Health in Australia at the moment, if you're following your Commonwealth stuff. Catherine King's the one that's responsible for this. You know, she can change it at her will. So that's the history of medical device regulation and where we're up to in Australia.
How regulatory history and stuff, was that in line with what's happened overseas, or was Australia
Australia was ahead, actually. Okay, Australia has been one of the forefront leaders in the development of standards to apply to medical devices. If I want to speak some jargon, who's heard of IEC 60601? Okay, IEC 60601 is the standard, is the International Electrotechnical Commission standard, which is deemed the international standard. Oh, unless you live in America. Forget about America, US, they do everything differently to the rest of the world. They regulate differently and they control differently, which is interesting if you're in the medical device development arena, because you either market into the US or you market into Europe and everywhere else. But to market into both, you've got to meet two different sets, which really makes it difficult. So that's where the regulatory consultants who market worldwide make their big bucks, because they understand the two different games and how to cover all the bases in one go. But IEC 60601, which was the definitive, oh geez, I thought I might have even brought it with me, was the definitive standard for medical devices that basically describes all the really basic stuff that every medical device must comply to, was developed out of Australian standard AS 3200. So Australia had all the standards first. Australia had the first standards for management of medical devices in hospitals. That's been copied internationally. Australia had the first standards for electrical safety and how all the electricity and everything had to be wired into a hospital. And that's been copied internationally. So Australia's actually been at the forefront of medical device development, believe it or not, in the world. In the 1980s, the biggest pacemaker manufacturing company in the world was in Sydney. That was Telectronics, okay? So we made all the pacemakers in Australia. We also invented CPAP, which ResMed became a huge, big company, and my department, a little bit before my time, made the first 8 prototype CPAP devices that ever went on patients for Professor Sullivan over here. We came in and he asked for one. So they made him one, and basically what they did was they got a big Perspex box, and he had this little blower motor, and he wanted to know how to control the pressure of the blower motor going out of the, he had this blower, and he knew that if he stuck this onto your nose, like a vacuum cleaner in reverse, and blew you up, it'd keep your airways open, and you'd stop snoring, and you wouldn't desaturate and have sleep apnea. But he didn't know how to control the pressure constantly. So what my guys did was they put it in a box, and they developed a reed valve, which is like just a little flap valve, and then an articulated thing that you could open up and close down over the reed valve to increase or decrease the resistance of the reed valve opening. And that gave him a very stable and sensitive output pressure that he could set at, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 20 centimetres of water. He's very pleased with that. It didn't really matter what the resistance was to the gas flow, it still maintained the pressure the same, because if you increased the output pressure, it would vent more pressure through the reed valve. Big Perspex box like this weighed about 20 kilos. In fact, it was so big that we went out and got one of those trolleys that you buy to trolley things around, and we put it on that because it was a lot easier to trolley it around on that than try and carry it. He came back about a month later and goes, geez, that was good. That worked. I want some more. And we went, oh no, Cole, we know you. No, you do it once and now you want more. So there was a big discussion that ensued about how many more do you want? And he goes, well, I know 5 or 6 patients out there that could really benefit from this. How about you build me 8? So we built him the first 8 prototype CPAP devices. At that stage, we were a little bit naive as a public health organisation in that we didn't protect our IP very well, because I wouldn't be standing here now if we did, all right? I'd be sailing around the Whitsundays or something on a big yacht. So the current international situation is that the EU, which is your CE marks, as you see, which means conforms to European standards. CE, it's not China export, as a lot of people think, okay? CE means conform to European standards. And if you look at the bottom of those CE marks, you'll see some of them have a number, okay? That number on the bottom of the CE mark is the number that lets you know what designated authority certified the device to comply with all the standards, all right? Without the number, the CE mark means nothing. And you'll see a lot of things with CE marks on it, but that means nothing if it doesn't have the number, okay? The US have always been difficult and different, and they have a much more onerous sort of in-house system that runs through the FDA. And it's so onerous at the moment is they have a 501 clause which allows you to grandfather devices. So if you developed an ECG machine back in the 60s or 70s and you build a new one today, it is far more easier for you to go back and grandfather it through this loophole and get it approved for sale in the US than it is to meet the current regulatory setup in the States from scratch. So there's two situations. Australia has been at the forefront of device development standards and legislation and therapeutic goods legislation. However, the Australians were wise enough to realise that we were a little island down here, and depending on who you talk to, we represent between 1 and 3% of the global sales for medical devices, which is really not very much. And on a pro rata basis, we spend a lot, but in terms of global sales, absolute bottom dollars, it ain't that much. So big multinational companies who are developing devices don't really care about the Australian market. So what Australia did was they have a thing called the Global Harmonisation Task Force, and they have big harmonisation committees. So they meet and this has been going on for 20 years, whereby all the countries get together once a year and have a big junket and all go meet in Switzerland or somewhere for a week. And they all sit around tables and talk about how they'll make it all the same. And at the moment, Australia's, because of our eminent position, is actually the chairman of that committee. Okay, I can't remember the exact name, but there's the chair of the committee to harmonise all the medical device regulation everywhere in the world, which includes Canada and includes South America and includes Mexico, is Australia. All right? So I hope that answers your question. The US still sit out there and do their own thing. They're still gallons and pints and inches and miles.
Is there any reason you think it's done? Why would it be so?
I think a lot of it started in Melbourne, believe it or not in Sydney. I think way back, it all started with a guy called David Dewhurst in the Second World War, who was a soldier and a physiologist and a engineer, and did a lot of medical device development during the Second World War using valve systems and things like that. And he was the first guy to really stand up and say, you know, we can do all of this, but someone's got to regulate it and make it safe. We've got to have standards, because back then all that stuff was pretty unreliable, to put it mildly, and pretty unsafe to begin with. I mean, the transistors only came around in the 60s, and moving from valves to transistors was a huge development in terms of reliability, but the early transistors weren't really that, they were certainly a lot more reliable than valves, but I don't know if they were particularly any more safe than valves. This is before we had integrated circuits, okay? So you're putting a medical device together, and I could probably go and find an old one out there that doesn't have an integrated circuit in it, but has circuit boards full of hundreds and hundreds of transistors, right? And if one of those transistors failed or became short or something like that, then the current that was applied to the patient could be quite excessive or kill you. And that was, that's why biomedical engineers in public hospitals came into existence, really, was back in the 70s and late 60s and 70s, was basically to go around and test everything, because it was all pretty unreliable. And that's changed a lot now. Everything's super reliable, super regulated, super quality manufacturing, quality systems. And so the reliability and safety of everything you can now commercially buy on the market is 1,000 times better than it was even 30 years ago. So the current Australian situation, TGA, so TGA can stand for the Therapeutic Goods Act, if you want, or the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which are the regulator. They're the guys that are charged with enforcing the Therapeutic Goods Act. Has anybody been to the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Canberra? It's nice. It's not actually in the middle of Canberra. It's in a paddock on the outskirts of Canberra. There's 650 people work there. It's a really lovely modern building. There's kangaroos hopping around and sheep. They graze sheep on the paddocks to keep the grass down. Sometimes we think they've sort of become sheep and kangaroos in their headspace, because they're always hopping around the place and acting like a big mob and following each other. But and they're not really going anywhere. But sorry, I'm being a bit cynical. TGA has a tough job to do, and they've had their successes, but they've had a couple of notable failures where they took on people like Pan Pharmaceutical and sued them for $20 million and put them out of business. You might have heard about that a few years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, because these guys weren't formulating drugs correctly, so they stopped them selling all the drugs that this company sold in Australia. They were one of the biggest drug manufacturers in Australia, and they'd only made a mistake with 2 or 3 of their drugs where they hadn't formulated them correctly. It was basically like they formulated them, they just didn't mix them correctly, so the dose varied between the tablets. So the TGA went in, sued him $20 million, shut down this guy's business. He took it to the High Court. He won. TGA had to pay him $200 million back. Right? So they got a bit wary about... a more recent one would be the PIP breast implants. TGA get up and go... can't say the French because it's a French name, but the PIP implants. They're all safe. If you read their webpage, no one needs to worry. A month later, they're explanting them all on the national health system in the UK because they're all worried. So the TGA sort of had to eat their words and go, oh, maybe these things aren't so safe. The most, in terms of medical devices, the other notable one that they kind of missed the plot on is metal and metal implants, which might be something that's near and dear to all of you, working out how to polish femoral heads and make better acetabular cups. The original metal and metal implants that were developed in the 60s and 70s were notoriously bad, which is why they got onto polyethylene cups and nylon cups and better polishing methods and all of this, that and the other. It wasn't so much that they fractured or failed, it was just that they wore. And then, you know, in the late 90s, they all decided that they were so smart they got their metal and metal implants down perfect, and they were better than the polyethylene ones because they were stronger and they wouldn't pull out and dislocate and all of that. So they go and implant all of them, and everybody approved all that, and actually made them quite a low-risk device, and I'll talk about that in a minute. On the 1st of July this year, they've had to, because of all the problems they've been having with metal and metal implants, they've had to increase the class of metal and metal implants from a class 2B to a class 3 device, and I'll describe that in a minute, okay? Which increases the amount of stuff that the manufacturer has to demonstrate before they're allowed to put them on the market as being safe. Personally, I don't think metal and metal implants will ever be safe, because you've got metal and metal sitting around in saline solution, and anybody who's ever owned a boat will know that, yeah, it lasts, but it doesn't last forever, metal and metal in salt water, you know. So anyway, the current Australian situation is we have the Therapeutic Goods Administration administrating the Therapeutic Goods Act, and we have the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So normally you get your stuff placed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, and then you're allowed to go and sell it, market it, promote it. You don't have to tell the whole truth as long as you don't lie, I guess. And so there's a lot of competition in the Australian device market, both for implants and for little boxes that go ping, you know, ECG machines and patient monitors and ventilators and all of that. And given the current financial situation, the pressure on reps to make their sales targets and things is pretty fearsome. Your average GE rep who works for General Electric, just selling one device line like patient monitors or ventilators would be on a quarterly sales target of $750,000, okay? If they don't make the first quarter, nothing gets said to them. If they don't make the second quarter, they get called in and given a sort of pep talk interview. If they don't make the third quarter, they get sacked and they get a new rep. So the reps are really sweating because there just isn't the market there at the moment, all right? It's tough out there in rep land unless you're on a real winner of a product. If you're on a real winner, yes, it's like riding black caviar or something, you know, you're just going to be unbeaten and you'll be right. But for the average run-of-the-mill one back in the field, it's tough going. So, you know, the Therapeutic Goods Administration isn't that stupid, and it knows that people won't get all the stuff that we want to use in Australia on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. It costs money. If you want to put high-risk devices on there, it costs a lot of money, okay? Hundreds of thousands of dollars if you want to put a pacemaker or something on there. If you want to put a Band-Aid, it's not so bad. So what they do is they have exemptions, and Exemptions are the sort of stuff that students need to know about. So this is how you can develop and build medical devices and continue along the pathway to commercialising them and using them in patients, but you're not going to be breaking the Therapeutic Goods Act, okay? And this is why I'm talking to you today, so that at least you know where you stand. I'm not saying you can't, it's all doable, you just got to know where the exemptions and loopholes and how to go about it in the right way are, because one thing you don't want to do is get in the bad books of the Therapeutic Goods Administration, okay? Because they're just going to make life difficult for you. They're like every other government bureaucracy. There's only 650 people there, maybe 100 power controllers, and they all know each other. So, they'll go, that Sydney Uni, they were a bad lot. We're all going to make life difficult for them, and then they can. Okay, within Australia and internationally, and this is part of the harmonisation with the European Union, is that they divide medical devices up into classes depending on how much risk is associated with the medical device, basically going from a class 1 device, then a class 1 device that's sterile, or a class 1 device that incorporates a measuring function. Sorry, this should be a class 2A, I missed the A there. Class 2B, class 3, and active implanted medical device. So an active implanted medical device is a pacemaker or one of those implanted drug infusion pumps, and there's a whole variety of those now for everything from insulin to narcotics to antispasmodic drugs if you've got spasticity and things like that. Having said that, we're harmonising different where a given device sits in what class actually does vary slightly between European. Most of it's the same, but some devices will sit in different classes depending on what country it is. Okay, all right. So and just recently they've moved the metal and metal implants from class 2B up to class 3 in Australia. That has huge regulatory impact on the suppliers of those devices, and huge costs involved. And I was at a meeting a month ago down in Darling Harbour where they were going through it all, and you could see these guys just walking out of the room going, well, I'm no longer financial, I'm going to have to shut up shop. I can't meet this, it's not worth it. I mean, the big players like Stryker and DuPont and Johnson & Johnson and Zimmer, they were probably all sitting up the back going, well, we'll lose a bit of company profit and we can probably do it and there's a lot more work for us, but the littler guys really whacked them. So what's a class 1 device? That's low risk. Look, this kid's been up to a bit of low risk activity riding his skateboard or something, but he's got a low risk medical device around his head, which is basically a bandage. It's not sterile. So bandages are a medical device, okay? It's used for therapy. It's a medical device. You wouldn't think so, would you? So class 1, sterile or incorporating a measurement function, low to medium risk. So Band-Aids, some Band-Aids, they've got sterile until opened on the package. They're a class 1 sterile device, okay? So they have to go through slightly more onerous things. Who knows what this is? Can someone give me the proper name? Yeah, sphygmomanometer. Try and say that after 3 beers on Thursday night at the SUAB function. Okay. And this is a class 1 device incorporating a measurement function. Okay. Class 2 devices. Okay, this is low to medium risk, and I used the tracheostomy tube, which is the tube they put down here where they cut your windpipe open when you can't breathe. This is a pretty gory picture. I did see this, and this is an example of exalphamus where your intestines in a baby is actually developed outside of the baby, so it's developing outside of the baby's mouth, and they have to ventilate the baby after it's been born because it will die because it can't breathe, so they're able to cut into the windpipe and ventilate the baby. Now, that looks pretty gross, but that baby went on to be perfectly normal. They were able to salvage that baby's life and get all those guts and things back inside the baby. and basically normal person. So they wouldn't be able to do that without biomedical engineers, by the way. So sometimes it does get a bit grotty out there and gross, but you saved the kid's life, so fine. Class 2B items are medium to high risk, and the example I chose here was artificial eyes. What changes the difference between Class 2A and 2B basically is 2A aren't made for permanent implantation. Class 2B are made for long-term permanent implantation. The rules, I've passed around the medical devices regulations. Now, I've got a book here called the Australian Regulatory Guidelines for Medical Devices. It's 330 pages long, okay? If you don't mind burning all the ink in your printer, you can actually go and download this off the Therapeutic Goods Administration website for free, not breaking copyright, and print it all off. About 40 or 50 pages in this book goes into how they classify medical devices into those classes that I showed you before based on risk, and there's lots of little sub-rules. I could teach a whole unit on this, so if you want to know more, go and download this and have a look, okay? All right? Or just have a look at it online. I'm going to give them a plug at the end, even though I've been giving them a hard time ever since. The Therapeutic Goods Administration actually has a very excellent website, and they're a very well-run organisation considering all the pressures, outside pressures that they're under. And I'd suggest any biomedical engineering student who hasn't been to the TGA website and played around in there is doing themselves a grave disservice. This is Class 3 devices. So this is what they've just turned metal and metal implants into, is Class 3 devices. So these are high-risk implants. They're not necessarily all implants, but these are electrocortography electrodes, right? So what they do is they pull out a bit of your skull. That's always an interesting procedure to watch. And then they take one of these electrode arrays, which are basically platinum discs sitting on silicon. And this is a 6 by 8, 6/8, 42 one, right? And so they've got 42 electrodes. They put that on the surface of your brain under the dura. This is the dura that they've peeled off the brain. All the wires go out. They'll keep your bit of skull in the bone bank. They have bone banks for the hospitals where they keep it all, and they wrap you all up in a bandage and put you in bed and see what your brain's doing. This gives you much more resolution than doing EEGs by using surface-mounted electrodes. Okay, so this is a radiograph of or medical imaging of the electrodes and where they're placed on the thing. If you're into neurosurgery or neurology, or you ever get the chance to in your career, I'd certainly recommend participating in a couple of these operations, because they're pretty interesting to see what people do when you start stimulating their brain directly. And neurosurgeons use this when they're excising tumours or looking for focus of epilepsy or things like that. Or performing frontal lobotomies is the other one I've seen it used in personally, so that they don't take out either the visual or motor cortex. Okay, so they'll stimulate, and if your fingers keep flipping around, they'll know that they haven't cut so far that they've destroyed your motor cortex. It's interesting, I've just put this graph on the bottom here, which basically shows that these electrodes can only be implanted for up to about a year, and then they fail and they don't work. They're not really designed for long-term implantation. So one of the big fields of research in biomedical engineering is functional stimulating electrodes, which are electrodes that interface directly with the nervous system, okay? It's a little bit of a holy grail at the moment if we can get electrodes, long-term implanted electrodes, so you can control artificial arms and whatever directly from your nervous system. That'd be fantastic. Or if you can put sensory or perceptual information into your brain directly. At the moment, the only successful example is the